My wife said it was just dinner with friends. I smiled, without smiling. And I responded with a calmness that even surprised me, then why aren't you wearing a ring? In that second, her silence said it all. The smile she tried to force cracked like glass under pressure. The absence of words was a scream. I said nothing more. I left. Not out of pride. Not out of anger. But because something inside me broke in a way that couldn't be mended. And when something breaks like that, what's left isn't silence, it's absence. She tried to hide it, tried to deny inside that what was between us had died. But anyone who's ever known true love knows when it stops breathing. And there, that night, he was buried without a wake, without tears. Just with a dry, good night and a door that closed softly, but with an end. For a long time, pain was a constant presence. Not the loud, explosive pain, but the kind that whispers in the corners of the day, that appears at coffee time, in the forgotten toothbrush, in the empty space next to me in bed. It wasn't jealousy. It was grief. Grief for someone who was alive, but who had killed me in life. And yet, for a long time, I tried to understand. I tried to find within myself the error that could have led to this. I tried to remember if I stopped looking, listening, touching. If I became predictable. If I forgot the flowers. The note in my pocket. The wine on Fridays. If love died from exhaustion or carelessness. But all I found were attempts. Many. Constant. Real. And even then, it wasn't enough. The betrayal didn't just hurt because of the flesh. It hurt because of the broken trust. Because of the fake laughter. Because of the kisses still wet from another body that were placed on me as if nothing had happened. Because of the shared bed after exchanging messages with another. Because of the lie rehearsed and repeated so many times until it became comfortable. It hurt because I became a supporting character in my own life. A shadow within the house I built with love. A wall that heard everything and knew nothing. I remember the first time I suspected. It was a trivial detail, she came back different from one of those dinners. Lighter. More distracted. Eyes that avoided mine. Measured words. A cold caress. And I, stupid or hopeful, thought it was just stress. Just another phase. But phases pass. And what came next was an abyss. She began to look at me like someone looking at a memory. She was present, but distant. She touched my face like someone holding an antique object, gently, but without affection. And I remained there, fighting for something that was already being undone behind my back. There was a night when she said she was going out with her friends. And she did. Smelling too good for a normal night out. Her smile was too restrained for someone who was about to laugh with other women. I asked, "Where are you going?" And she, without blinking, said, "New restaurant, just between us." And I just nodded. But I watched. Her eyes avoided mine. Her phone became an extension of her body. The screen always facing down. The ringer was off. The laughter was silent. And all of this suffocated me, but I still clung to the idea that it could be something else. I didn't want to believe it. Because believing in the betrayal was admitting that it was all a lie. It was naming the end. But then came that moment. The one when the soul understands what the mind refuses to accept. She was ready to leave, beautiful, perfumed, with a strange glint in her eye. And I simply said, "You're not wearing a ring." She froze. She tried to smile. But it wasn't a smile anymore. It was an attempt to cover up an earthquake. And then, I knew. I didn't need to hear anything else. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just got up, grabbed my keys, and left. There was nothing to say. Love had already died, all that was missing was the certificate. She tried to keep the affair a secret. As if it were possible to hide something that had already torn the very essence of who we were. She kept going out. Pretending. Coming back late. Saying it was complicated at work, that things were tough. But the truth is, when you lie too much, your soul begins to weigh you down. And your body, once light, becomes sluggish. Your eyes lose their sparkle. Your tone of voice becomes strange. And she began to lose herself in her own lies. Every day, farther away from me. And farther away from herself. The lover. A rough sketch of what she thought she deserved. He didn't love her. He never had. He was just a pastime. A challenge. A distraction. And when she tried to give more weight to what they had, he simply disappeared. He made it clear the game was over. That she was a pawn, not a partner. That there was no future, only moments. And she, for the first time, felt what it was like to be discarded by someone who never intended to truly hold her hand. And she was left alone. With the absence of her ring and the weight of regret. With the memories of everything she destroyed with a gesture, a lie, a touch. And me? I was reborn. Little by little. Over time. I met someone. Someone who looked me in the eye. Who didn't shy away from the truth. Who wasn't afraid to love calmly. And it was in this calm that I found myself. I discovered that true love doesn't need to shout. It breathes. It warms. It embraces. And it teaches that pain doesn't have to last forever. One day, I met my ex-wife again. She was different. Her eyes were heavy. Her words were cautious. She apologized. And I accepted. Not for her sake. But for mine. Because forgiving isn't about going back. It's about freeing yourself. And she understood. She understood that the love she threw away was now someone else's love. That the touch that was once hers was now someone who knew how to care. That the future we could have had was buried along with the lie. And that there's no going back when what was broken was trust. You can't mend what was torn by selfishness. And when, months later, she saw us dancing, me and her new love, at a regular party, with mutual friends, there was no more pain in my eyes. There was peace. A calm smile. A genuine affection. And she noticed. She realized that laughter there, free, light, full of life, was a laughter she could never take from me. Because perhaps she never understood who I truly was. And only in that moment, with the music loud and the tempo slow, she cried. Not from longing. But from loss. From regret. From knowing, without a shadow of a doubt, that she had lost the love of her life. And that, this time, it wasn't just dinner with friends. It was goodbye. But what she doesn't know yet, is that her new love is keeping a secret. A small but decisive detail. Something that could change everything, once again. Something that could make this story not end as she imagined, or perhaps, end exactly as it deserves. Welcome to the channel. Here, betrayal will never be romanticized. It will never be justified. All the stories you hear are fictional, but the feelings they evoke are real, because moral is clear: betrayal destroys, hurts and leaves scars that not even time can erase. Get ready now for a story shocking, intense and full of twists and turns, which will keep you hooked from start to finish. Take a deep breath. What comes next will move you. They met simply, almost casually, as if fate had decided to place a question mark on an ordinary day. It was supposed to be just another party with mutual friends, another ordinary evening with light laughter and low music, but all it took was a glance and everything around them fell silent. His name was Daniel, and she was Laura. There was no overwhelming passion at first, no instant promises of eternal love. What existed was a conversation that took its time, a connection that built unhurriedly, almost imperceptibly. The kind of connection that begins slowly, as if both were tiptoeing inside each other, discovering without invading, sensing without rushing. Daniel was the kind of man who spoke little but observed a lot. He had a sense of humor that lingered between the lines and a gaze that always seemed to seek a little more into the soul of whoever stood before him. He worked as a photographer, capturing small details that would go unnoticed by anyone too rushed to pay close attention. He was someone who valued time, the pause between words, the silence that didn't weigh down. Laura, on the other hand, came from a busy routine, a firm-spoken, decisive woman with a keen sense of justice and an engaging way of moving through the world. A lawyer, accustomed to arguing, facing challenges, asserting herself in environments dominated by egos and competition. And perhaps it was precisely this difference in energy that drew them to each other, his calm, her strength. Two opposites that didn't cancel each other out, but that, for a time, seemed to complement each other. Their relationship blossomed naturally. It wasn't an idealized bed of roses, but there was no early drama either. They learned from each other, compromised when necessary, respected each other's space, and built, brick by brick, a relationship based on companionship. When they decided to move in together, it wasn't impulsive. It was after many conversations, penciled-in accounts, and plans scribbled on napkins over morning coffees. They rented a modest apartment in a quiet neighborhood, decorated with care by both, each piece of furniture hand-picked, each painting representing something they'd experienced together. There was love in the details. In the choice of the living room lamp, the picture frame on the bookshelf, each one's favorite cup. The house exuded conviviality, smelled of life together. On weekends, he would make breakfast and she would choose the day's soundtrack. There was a quietly happy routine between them, an unchoreographed dance where each knew where to step. Over time, Daniel began to capture small moments of their lives with his camera. A hurried coffee, an unguarded laugh on the couch, a forgotten kiss on the porch. Laura, initially resistant to the idea of seeing herself so exposed, eventually surrendered to his gaze. She said Daniel made her see herself in a way she had never seen herself before. Lighter, more human. More real. He saw beauty in small gestures, in disarming expressions, and taught her to do the same. It was in this process of discovering and revealing themselves that they fell deeper in love. They matured together. They made travel plans, talked about children, tenderly discussed what their first child would be named. There was no rush, but there was hope. Their social circle also adjusted to this new era. Mutual friends began to have quiet dinners at home, and Sundays became days of gatherings, laughter, and sincere exchanges. Daniel's family embraced Laura as if she were already part of their blood, and the opposite was also true. Her mother used to say that Daniel was the kind of rare man who spoke little but conveyed everything with a gesture. He wasn't overly intense, but profoundly present. He never withdrew emotionally. He was there, always, with his body and his gaze. There were no absences between them. No long distances. Only the comfortable silences of those who feel at home in the other. And even with time, the relationship didn't cool. There wasn't that sudden change many people report. Daniel continued to leave short notes stuck to the refrigerator door with phrases like, "Today will be a good day, you'll see," or "I'll be back with wine, save a kiss for me." And Laura still brought small, undated gifts, just to say, "I was thinking of you." There was affection in the gestures, care in the looks, and the constant touch of those who still choose each other every day. Of course, there were arguments. Sometimes over trivial matters, other times over deeper differences. But there was always a way forward. There was always a bridge between them. They didn't go to bed angry. It was an unspoken rule, but one that was loyally respected. On their anniversary, they usually had simple dinners at home. No fancy restaurants. They loved the idea of cooking together, sharing the kitchen, laughing about the wrong seasoning or overcooked rice. They created memories there, between the sink and the stove. Between a sip of wine and an old song on the radio. Small memories that would later become important, though, at that moment, they were just part of their love. Laura, however, began to take on more responsibilities at work. Long work hours, late meetings, quick trips to resolve last-minute legal disputes. Daniel understood, supported, even though he felt her absence at home. Even sleeping in empty beds some nights. Even dining alone often. He didn't complain, but he noticed. And with each new disappearance, each new excuse, his gaze registered something. A shadow. A seed of doubt that wasn't yet strong, but already there. And yet, he believed. Because he believed in her. Because he trusted in what they had built together. There was a period when she began to change little things. Her perfume. Her way of dressing. Her way of speaking on the phone. Daniel noticed, but didn't interpret it as a sign of something wrong. He thought it was just a phase. An attempt to reinvent herself. To reclaim something of herself. After all, it's not uncommon for people who love to change. And he respected that. Laura had always been intense, and he knew that love doesn't nullify individuality. She needed her own space, and he was willing to give it to her. But there was something in the air. Something subtle. Almost imperceptible. A kind of distance that isn't measured in meters, but in silence. And even with his intuition triggering small warning signs, Daniel chose not to judge. To not anticipate pain. Even her closest friends began to notice her absences. The excuses. The lack of time. But no one said anything. Because no one wanted to believe something was missing there. Because in everyone's eyes, they were the perfect couple. The duo that worked. The epitome of balance. Proof that love, when true, survives storms. And perhaps that's why the truth took so long to be seen. Because when something seems too perfect, we learn to look elsewhere. Daniel continued to record everyday life with his camera. Now more alone. Laura's portraits became fewer and fewer. The images became more introspective. Emptier. But he said nothing. He demanded nothing. He simply continued. Out of love, out of faith, or out of fear of losing what he wasn't sure still existed. And Laura, even when absent, still said, "I love you," before leaving. She still laid her head on his chest on nights when he was home. She still made plans for the weekend. But her eyes, even when smiling, didn't truly smile. Their story, up until that point, was one of construction. Of companionship. Of genuine exchange. A story like so many others. Full of love, but also of silence. Of effort, but also of lapses. Of beauty, but also of shadows that still had no name. And it was in this fragile balance that time passed. That the days began to change. That Daniel's gaze began to grow more alert. And that life, with its silent way of preparing us for the inevitable, began to show signs that not everything would be as before. Not everything would stay the same. And then, on an ordinary night, like so many others, something finally changed. But that is another part of the story. The routine gradually lost its sound, its weight, and its color. There were no fights, no slammed doors, no shouts in the hallway. There was only the most dangerous thing in a relationship, the comfortable silence that seeps into the cracks of everyday life and establishes an invisible distance. Daniel began to notice the details that had previously camouflaged themselves in the comfort of a mature love. Laura, who had always been present, even on the busiest days, now seemed to exist on a different frequency. Her kisses became too short, her words too practical, her absences too long. Schedules no longer matched, messages came spaced out, and explanations came before he even had a chance to ask. He wasn't the controlling type, never had been. But there was something inside him that prevented him from ignoring what was too obvious to go unnoticed. The connection that once flowed effortlessly now seemed to require effort to stay alive. Laura began to dedicate herself unusually to a new project at the office. She spoke about it with enthusiasm, like someone who had rediscovered an old motivation. Daniel, at first, felt proud. He knew her ambition, her competence, and admired her dedication. What he didn't expect was that, over time, everything surrounding the project would begin to occupy the space that had previously been his. Evenings that were once divided between the couch and light conversations were now swallowed up by late meetings, networking events, and dinners with the team. Mondays began to feel like Thursdays, Sundays became the eve of something more important, and the house ceased to be a refuge and became merely a transit point. He tried to talk patiently. He said he missed her, that he understood their commitments, but that there was a void growing between them. Laura listened, smiled gently, touched his hand, and told him it was okay, that it was just a phase, that things would get back to normal. Her words had the sweetness of someone who believed what they said, but her eyes said something else. She had distanced herself so subtly that, for a while, Daniel doubted his own intuition. He began to think he might be being dramatic, perhaps insecure. And then, instead of persisting, he backed off. And as he backed off, he observed. Her clothes began to change. Her perfumes became stronger, her heels higher, her time in front of the mirror longer. There was a glow about her presence when she left, and a disconcerting weariness when she returned. Once, she left her phone at home. A rare mistake for someone who was always glued to her device. Daniel didn't look right away. He hesitated. He fought the temptation to access something that had always been too intimate, too personal. But there were messages arriving, notifications flashing, and discomfort burning inside. When he opened it, there were no explicit conversations. But there were clues. A recurring name, frequently exchanged emojis, times that coincided with absences. And then, a click. A name he'd heard before, mentioned quickly, informally, as if it were someone irrelevant. A new partner at the firm. Young. Charismatic. Newly arrived. Daniel said nothing. He stored the information, along with his anguish, and decided to observe. It wasn't in his nature to confront without certainty. But her every gesture took on a new weight. Each outing became an uncomfortable chapter. Each kiss, a test. And little by little, what was love became surveillance. Not the aggressive kind, but the silent kind. The kind that keeps track of schedules, memorizes clothes, pays attention to the sound of heels echoing down the hallway. The kind of surveillance that wears you down, that erodes trust and transforms your heart into a battleground between hope and reality. A few weeks later, she invited him to a dinner to celebrate the project's success. She said it would be informal, that there would be no need for him to go, since it would be mostly just the work team. He insisted on going along, but she insisted on going alone. She used the argument of practicality, fatigue, and the formality of the setting. And he relented. She came out wearing a dress he'd never seen before. Darker lipstick, her hair tied back in a way that made him uneasy. And the absence of a wedding ring. When he asked, she answered too quickly, as if she'd already expected the question. She said she'd forgotten it in the bathroom, that she'd slipped while washing her hands. But Daniel knew Laura, who used words as a shield. And there, something was confirmed. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat on the couch, with the light off, and listened to the wall clock. Each tick was like a reminder that time was passing, and perhaps already had. When she returned, she had a gentle, almost rehearsed smile on her face. A smile that said nothing. And that's when he asked, quietly, without getting up from the chair, "Did dinner with your friends have a good time?" She froze. It wasn't the question she'd expected. She tried to maintain control, her smile, her lightness. But before she could answer, he added, "Then why aren't you wearing your ring?" The question fell like a weight to the floor. And she fell silent. The kind of silence that screams. That betrays. That reveals more than any sentence. There was no more room for pretense. There was no more room for white lies. Daniel didn't expect a confession. He didn't want a fight. He didn't want to hear excuses. He simply stood, looked at her one last time, and left. Without raising his voice. Without taking anything. Only with the certainty that this was the end of a story. The revelation wasn't dramatic. There was no scandal. But there was something worse, the silent shattering of a trust that had taken years to build. Laura stood there, her shoulders hunched, her lipstick still intact, but her soul in tatters. She tried to carry on with her routine in the days that followed, tried to act as if nothing had happened. But the house was empty. The walls seemed colder. And time slowed. Her lover, once intense and present, became scarce. The relationship that had seemed like an escape was now just a burden. A reminder of a choice that had cost her dearly. Daniel, for his part, immersed himself in silent days. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just walked. Each step was a farewell to what they had been. He didn't block things, he didn't delete photos, he didn't burn letters. He simply left everything where it was, like someone abandoning a battlefield knowing that no victory is worth the price of dignity. He didn't seek answers. Because he already knew them all. He didn't need to hear from her mouth what his eyes had already understood. But there was something he didn't know yet. Something that would change the course of everything once again. A hidden piece in this puzzle. A subtle detail that escaped her watchful eyes. A truth she kept hidden not out of strategy, but out of fear. And which, very soon, would come to light without warning. The days passed unhurriedly. Without forgiveness. Without return. Laura tried to return to her routine, but nothing fit. The house that once vibrated with life was now just a space echoing with absence. She tried to convince herself it was just a phase. That Daniel needed time. That he would return. She believed, or wanted to believe, that their love wouldn't be lost because of a mistake. A mistake that now grew like a weight she could no longer hide, even from herself. He had disappeared from her company, from social networks, from the streets she used to walk. Her friends couldn't tell her where he was, and even without the courage to look for him directly, she woke up every day with her phone next to her bed, waiting for a message that never came. She tried to justify his silence with pride. Then with hurt. But deep down, she knew. She knew the betrayal had left a scar too deep for her, one that neither time nor apologies could erase. Her lover pulled away as quickly as he'd approached. Once present, intense, and desirous, he now responded to her messages late and without enthusiasm. She demanded dates, but he was always busy, tired, distant. And when they finally met again, he was too direct, too cold. He said he hadn't promised anything, that he wasn't ready for something serious, and that, for him, everything that had happened had been just a good moment. Nothing more. The blow was sharp, violent. Laura fell silent. For the first time, she realized she'd bet everything on a fantasy. She'd lost Daniel for something that wasn't even real. For an impulse, for a delusion disguised as freedom. And now, there was neither floor nor ceiling. Only a void too hard to be filled with memories. The following weeks were an unspoken punishment. Daniel's absence became more palpable with each passing day. And regret now left visible marks on Laura's face. She lost weight, lost sleep, and began forgetting appointments. She avoided the places they'd frequented together, but everywhere she saw pieces of him. She began walking aimlessly after work, perhaps trying to find a trace of him among the unfamiliar faces. Until, one afternoon, she saw him. He was leaving a coffee shop, smiling, calm, holding hands with another woman. A woman she didn't know, but who, for some reason, seemed to fit perfectly beside him. She wasn't the kind of blatantly beautiful, but there was a sweetness in the stranger's gaze, a serenity in the way she held his hand. Laura froze. They didn't see her. And she didn't want to be seen. She simply turned and walked away. Her heart pounded in her chest, not with jealousy, but with loss. It was real now. Daniel had moved on. In the days that followed, she saw them again. And each time, there was that same air of peace. A visible affection, needing no exaggeration. There was no ostentation, no provocation. It was just love. Simple and real. And that tore her apart more than any jealous outburst could. It was then that she decided to do something. Right. Not a long letter. Just a few sincere words. She apologized. She said she didn't expect forgiveness, but that she needed him to know she acknowledged everything she'd done. That he had been her home, and that she'd destroyed it all for a mistake she could no longer fix. She didn't ask to return. She simply wanted to wash away the weight of guilt that had weighed her down. She sent the message without expecting a reply. The answer came 2 days later. Short. Clear. I forgave to move on in peace. Not to return. That was it. Not a single extra comma. And yet, that was all. That full stop was confirmation that, this time, it was for real. The end wasn't temporary. It wasn't a time. It was the end. Definitive. A few weeks later, she received an invitation to a get-together organized by mutual friends. She hesitated about going. She knew he would be there. She didn't want to confront him. She didn't want to see him with someone else, she didn't want to be met with that look of pity. But something inside her told her she had to go. She had to face reality with dignity. Not as someone begging for scraps, but as someone who owned her choices. The place was a small, secluded room, with low lights and ambient music. People laughed, toasted, and shared stories from the past. And then he entered. With her. The new woman. They crossed the room lightly, greeting friends, smiling sincerely. Laura saw them from afar, holding her breath for a few seconds. They didn't see her right away. But at some point, their eyes met. Daniel saw her. And for the first time since then, he stared at her for a few seconds. Without anger. Without sadness. Without any weight. It was just a neutral look. Almost gentle. As if she were someone from the past he held with respect, but without longing. Later that night, the music changed. It played an old song, one Laura knew well. And it was then that she saw the two of them dancing. Daniel held the new woman gently. He smiled as he whispered something in her ear. And then he laughed. A light, spontaneous, free laugh. Laura watched the scene as if she were outside her body. That laugh, that sparkle in his eyes, it was a Daniel she had never seen. Not like that. Not so whole. It was as if, beside that woman, he had found a version of himself she had never been able to reach. And there, as she held the glass with trembling hands, she understood. Truly understood. He was the love of her life. And she lost him. At that moment, her eyes filled with tears. She didn't cry loudly, didn't make a scene. She just lowered her head, feeling her breath hitch. It hurt like never before. It wasn't jealousy. It was grief. Grief for a love she'd killed with her own hands. And now, she was burying it without flowers. Hours later, as they were leaving the party, their paths crossed again. Daniel approached. Laura didn't know what to expect. He greeted her with a kiss on the cheek, formal and respectful. She tried to smile, but her eyes gave everything away. He said few words. He said he hoped she was well. That he wished her peace. And before turning away, he hesitated for a second. Then he said, "Everything you feel now. I felt it before. But the difference is that I moved on. And you stayed." And he left. With her. Hand in hand. Without looking back. But Laura didn't know everything yet. There was still something more. Something that would transform the weight of regret into something even more cruel. A small but devastating detail. A secret she would discover days later, unintentionally. A secret that would make her loss even more irreversible. And her pain, unbearably just. A few days after the party, Laura decided to go for a walk. It wasn't out of habit anymore, but out of necessity. She needed air, silence, something to take her out of herself. The city still had the same sounds, the same movements, but nothing felt the same. There were no longer enough distractions to contain what was building inside her. Every street held something of him. Every park bench seemed to hold a memory. She continued walking until she stopped in front of a small, discreet gallery with a glass display case illuminated by warm, soft light. Inside, black and white photographs filled the walls, creating a melancholic contrast with the forgotten joy outside. It was a new exhibition, with few visitors, and the sign at the entrance announced only one name, Daniel Carvalho, the delicacy of absence. Laura felt her chest tighten. He hesitated for a full second before the glass door. I'd never been one to run away, but there was something there that seemed to promise more pain than comfort. Still, he entered. The place was silent. Footsteps echoed through the hardwood floor, and the aroma of coffee mixed with the smell of ink and paper gave the space an intimate atmosphere. The photos, delicately arranged, were all records of seemingly mundane moments, a cup forgotten on the edge of the sink, a bed still unmade with sunlight streaming through the sheets, a pair of sneakers side by side in front of the door. But there was something deeply intimate in each image. As if they belonged to a larger story. As if they spoke, without words, of a love that no longer existed. She walked slowly, passing each painting as if unraveling pieces of herself. Until she stopped before the last image. It was a photo taken from afar, herself, sitting on the porch of her old house, hugging her knees, staring into space, her hair tied awkwardly and her expression blank. The caption underneath simply read, "When love was still there, but she was already gone." Laura felt her legs give out. She leaned against the nearest wall and remained there, motionless. There was no hatred in those images. Only truth. A truth that pierced her without asking permission. That's when one of the curators approached discreetly and said that Daniel often stopped by in the late afternoons, sometimes just to observe people's reactions. She asked if Laura would like to leave a message for him in a notebook at the entrance, where visitors could write about the emotions they felt while viewing the exhibition. Laura just shook her head. She didn't want to write. She wanted to understand. She wanted to talk. But she knew she no longer had that space. He had surrendered his pain to art, and art to the world. She had lost the privilege of conversing with the man who now communicated through images. 3 days later, chance, or perhaps fate, crossed their paths again. It was a small bookstore, a place they both frequented often, albeit at different times. Laura entered on impulse, trying to escape a quiet afternoon, and saw him there, sitting in the back of the store, a book open on the table, the same woman beside him. They weren't holding hands, but their eyes spoke volumes. She hesitated for a few seconds, then approached. Daniel saw her, closed the book slowly, as if knowing their encounter could no longer be avoided. The woman beside him seemed to understand immediately. She stood up without a word, touched Daniel's shoulder lightly, and walked away. Laura remained standing before him, her eyes fixed on his, as if seeking permission to speak. Daniel simply pointed to the chair opposite. She sat. There was a silence that seemed endless. The sounds of the bookstore continued in the background, but between them, only silence. Until she took a deep breath and spoke in a low, almost measured, yet firm voice. "You look good." Daniel looked up for a brief moment and replied. "I am." She nodded, as if she already knew the answer. He tried to find the right words, but everything seemed too small to say. Until he said what he'd been hammering on for weeks. "You laughed. At the party. Dancing with her. I've never seen you laugh like that." Daniel stared at her longer this time. There was no hurt in his eyes, but there was distance. There was certainty. "Because with her I am light. With you I loved with weight." Laura felt the shock. Not from cruelty, but from precision. Daniel wasn't speaking out of anger. He spoke with the coldness of someone who had overcome. She lowered her eyes, trying to hold back her reaction, but she couldn't. I know I lost you, Daniel. I know. But, there's one thing I need to know. Did you really love me? Daniel rested his elbows on the table and leaned forward a little. More than myself. But that was before you left, even though you were here. And before I understood that loving someone doesn't mean enduring everything in silence. Laura closed her eyes. Her throat burned. Her eyes wanted to overflow, but she couldn't fall apart there. Not anymore. Just as she was about to get up, he stopped her. There's something you might want to know. She sat back down. Her body was now rigid. Her heart was racing. Remember the night you left saying it was just dinner with friends? She nodded, already feeling the weight of the words before they were even spoken. That night, I knew. Not because you weren't wearing a ring. Not because of any detail. But because when you left, I followed you. The silence that fell was thick. Laura looked at him in disbelief. He continued. Not out of distrust. Not out of revenge. But because I needed to know with my own eyes that the end had come. I saw you too. On the sidewalk. Laughing. He kissed you. And you kissed him back. Laura didn't know what to say. She tried to mumble something, but Daniel stopped her with a calm gesture. I went home, packed my backpack, left the key, and left. I just needed a moment to say goodbye in silence. You didn't know why. In that moment, I understood that screaming wouldn't bring back love. And I also understood that keeping it to myself was the way to preserve what little dignity I had left. She clapped her hands over her mouth. The shock was so intense it felt like she was gasping for air. This changed everything. All the pain, all the doubts, all the regret. Now she knew he'd seen it. That he'd left out of self-love. Not because he'd found out later. This hurt more than any assumption. More than any cold response. Why didn't you ever tell me this? She asked in a choked whisper. Daniel lowered his gaze, thoughtful. When he looked back at her, there was sadness, but also peace. Because it wouldn't change anything. And because, knowing you didn't care enough to hide it, was the answer I needed. She was silent. Her body trembled. But he wasn't finished yet. That night, after I left, I went straight to the gallery. I didn't know what to do. I was hurt, yes. But also, relieved. Relieved that I no longer had to pretend. That's where I met Clara. The name was a punch. She didn't know, but she suspected. Clara. The woman from the coffee shop. From the party. From the bookstore. She was there organizing the collection, saw me come in with puffy eyes, and didn't say anything. She just gave me a coffee. We sat in silence for hours. And after that, we started talking. Little by little. Unhurriedly. She never wanted to replace anyone. But she taught me how to breathe again. Laura felt her throat close up. Now it made sense. Everything. His timing, his light gaze, his free laugh. Daniel stood up, adjusted the strap of his backpack, and took one last look. You taught me what it means to love deeply. She taught me what it means to be loved lightly. Thank you for everything. But, now, I really need to go. And it was. Laura remained seated. Motionless. The people around her continued their lives. But inside her, the world had stopped. She didn't lose Daniel when he left home. Nor when he saw her with someone else. She lost him when he chose to move on, and found someone who loved him as he deserved. And that, she knew, was a kind of loss from which one never recovers. The bookstore door closed behind Daniel, and with it, an entire cycle within Laura closed. The sound of the latch echoed louder than any scream she could have uttered at that moment. The silence that followed was no ordinary emptiness. It was a silence that filled everything, that weighed on her shoulders, that vibrated in her throat like a stifled scream. People continued to come and go, browsing books, buying coffee, going about their daily lives, while inside her, a part of the world was quietly crumbling. Sitting there, alone, she relived every word spoken, every image, every expression on his face. The pain was no longer from the loss, nor from the immediate regret, but from something even crueler, the profound understanding that she had been the direct cause of the end of something that, if cared for, could have been forever. There was no consolation. There was no rewriting. What remained now was the shadow of everything that had once been alive. She left the bookstore aimlessly. She walked the sidewalks as if searching for answers in unfamiliar faces, in shop windows, in signs, in anything that would pull her out of that inner turmoil. She passed places that once held meaning, now unrecognizable, as if they belonged to another life. Her pain had no name, but it had form. It was a constant presence, a living reminder of everything that had ceased to exist through carelessness, ego, and absence. The image of Daniel beside Clara reappeared as an inescapable reminder that he had found what she had failed to offer. But what crushed her most was knowing that he had seen her that night. That he had witnessed with his own eyes her choice, her betrayal, and yet, he had chosen silence. Not the silence of omission, but the silence of dignity, of pain born with maturity, of a decision made out of self-love. And that silence, now, screamed within her. In the days that followed, Laura tried to reorganize her life. She returned to work with a mechanical effort, immersed herself in processes, deadlines, hearings, trying to fill the void with activity. But there was no focus. No distraction could erase the images that haunted her mind at every corner. Messages from friends dwindled. Some drifted away naturally. Others, out of loyalty to Daniel, preferred silence. And even those who still tried to stay in touch seemed to maintain a safe distance, as if afraid to be complicit in her pain. She didn't blame them. She knew she had crossed a line from which there was no return. And even if there had been forgiveness, which there was, in fact, the truth was that trust, once broken, couldn't be rebuilt with words. It needed time, commitment, truth. And she no longer had that time. The dilemma gnawing at her now was no longer about what she had done, but about what to do with what was left. How to move on after destroying something so precious. How to start over, knowing that the mistake wasn't the result of mere impulse, but of a conscious choice. She looked in the mirror and barely recognized herself. Not by her appearance, but by her gaze. There was a new weariness there, a lack of radiance she hadn't even known existed before. There were no more excuses. There were no more justifications. Only the cold, hard realization that loving someone isn't always enough. You have to know how to care. Protect. Respect. And when that breaks, what's lost isn't just the other person. It's yourself, too. A few nights later, Laura returned to the gallery where Daniel's photos were displayed. It was the last day of the exhibition. The place was more crowded than the first time. She stood for a while, observing the people. Each one had their own particular reaction. Some cried. Others stood for long minutes before a single image. There was something universal about those photos. The pain, the love, the absence. Everything there seemed to tell the story of many, not just one couple. When she approached the last image again, the one where she appeared sitting on the porch, a couple stood in front of it, whispering. The woman said it was her favorite photo. That she could feel what the seated woman was thinking, even without seeing her completely. The man agreed, saying it was as if the photographer had captured the exact moment someone realizes they've lost everything. Laura walked away silently. It was more than a blow. It was a mirror. On the way out, she ran into Clara. It wasn't planned. Clara was alone, as if she'd come just to say goodbye to Daniel's works. The two stared at each other for long seconds. Laura didn't know how to react. She wanted to run away, but she also felt that this encounter needed to happen. Clara approached, calmly, and gently told her that she knew who she was. She also said she wasn't there to judge. Laura remained silent, expecting an attack, a moral lesson, anything. But Clara simply continued, her tone almost sweet. You are part of a story that still lives in every photo here. That doesn't fade. But Daniel, he found peace. And I only hope you find it too. Laura tried to say something. Maybe an apology, maybe a thank you. But the words wouldn't come. Clara smiled slightly, took a step back, and waved goodbye. And she left. Just like that, without resentment. Without rancor. Without the need to mark her territory. There was something disarming about that woman. A lightness difficult to face, especially for someone who no longer remembered what it felt like to feel peace. On the way home, Laura passed a street where she used to walk with Daniel in the late afternoons. There was a wooden bench beside a tree, where they often sat just to talk about their day. She approached, sat, and closed her eyes. She remained there for long minutes, in silence, feeling the wind touch her face. For the first time, he didn't try to escape the pain. He just let it be. And in that moment, he realized that perhaps this was the first step. Not to rebuild the past, that was impossible, but to rebuild himself from within. To understand that some choices are irreversible, that some pains are incurable. But they have meaning. And the meaning of that pain was to teach. Her longing for Daniel would never cease. But now, it was no longer desire. It was respect. A kind of silent reverence for the love she couldn't protect. And the cruelest thing of all was that he was right, she stayed. Trapped in that love she destroyed. While he moved on. And was truly happy. But something still awaited her. An unexpected encounter. A final conversation. A moment that would reveal a truth not even Daniel knew. And that, when revealed, would leave new, and lasting marks. Laura no longer lived for the days, but for the small pauses between them. She woke early, but took a long time to get up. She left for work, but carried with her the constant feeling of missing something she couldn't name. She still frequented the same places, spoke to the same colleagues, performed the same rituals, but there was no true presence in any of her gestures. The street seemed colder, the people more distant, as if the world were moving on without her. It was like watching her own life from outside a window. Everything passed, everything happened, but nothing truly touched her. And yet, she carried on, as if carrying an invisible weight, as if no longer seeking excuses or escapes, but simply enduring. One rainy afternoon, while sorting through old boxes in the back of her closet, she found a forgotten folder filled with yellowed papers, old photographs, movie tickets, notes exchanged with Daniel in the early years. There was a whole life piled up in fragile papers. She picked up a small, sealed envelope in his handwriting. She couldn't remember seeing it before. She opened it carefully, her heart racing. Inside was a short, handwritten letter dated almost 2 years ago. Daniel said he had applied for an artist residency program in Italy. A 3-month project where independent artists would spend time in a creative retreat. He spoke of his desire to go but said he would only make the decision if she agreed. The letter ended with a question: is it possible to love you from afar, for a while, if it means coming back more whole? She never answered. She never knew the paper existed. He probably never had the courage to show her. And now, all of that was beyond the reach of time. He had moved on. She had stayed. Of all the wrong choices, perhaps the cruelest was this, not noticing the signs of someone who was trying to be happy with her. That same night, sitting at the table with a cold cup of coffee in her hands, she received an unexpected call. It was Enrique, Daniel's older brother. They had spoken rarely since the breakup, out of mutual respect, out of shared grief. His voice was filled with something she couldn't decipher. He said he needed to see her. That there was something that couldn't wait. She hesitated for a second, but his tone left no room for refusal. They arranged to meet the next morning at a discreet café, far from the center, where they wouldn't risk uncomfortable stares. Enrique arrived before her, as he always did. He was serious, his hands fidgeting, staring into space. When Laura arrived, he stood, but didn't smile. He only greeted her with a slight nod. They sat in silence. For a while, she just watched him. She knew something was coming. Something that might change the course of what remained of her feelings. He began slowly, as if searching for the right words so as not to cause more pain than necessary. He told her that Daniel planned to travel with Clara the following month. That they had decided to take some time alone, away from everything, to start a new chapter. And then, after a long pause, Enrique took a small wooden box from inside his coat. Laura looked at the object, but didn't understand. Enrique placed it on the table and said it was something Daniel had left with him weeks before, asking him to only give it to him if he thought it would be necessary. And now, after everything, he thought it was. Laura opened it carefully. Inside the box was a flash drive. That's all. She looked at Enrique, who nodded slowly, as if to say, "You have to see it." Back home, his hands trembling, he connected the device to his computer. A single video, named after Laura's last birthday. She remembered that, on that day, Daniel had disappeared for hours and returned with a simple cake, a bottle of wine, and a serene smile. He said the gift would come later. But there never was. The video began with him in front of the camera, sitting on the porch where they used to spend their late afternoons. His face was calm, but his eyes had a depth she hadn't seen since long before their separation. In the video, he said he'd spent months trying to understand where he'd lost himself in his own relationship. He spoke calmly, without accusations. He said he understood that love sometimes changes places. That people transform. But that he never stopped loving. He just wished he'd had the chance to be loved again. He shared details she herself had forgotten, the way he'd made her coffee when he knew she was having a hard day, how he learned to like white wine just because she liked it, how he'd stayed up all night when she traveled for work, just to feel close even from a distance. And then, he told her what she could never have expected. Daniel talked about the moment she cheated on him, and how it made him realize he needed to reinvent himself. But soon after, he explained that, days before leaving, he discovered he'd been accepted into the artist residency program. He only didn't go because, upon seeing her with another man, he felt the whole thing had lost its meaning. She said she stayed home that week not because she had nowhere to go, but because she didn't want to run away before trying to understand the depth of the love she still carried. And then, at the end of the video, he said something she would never forget. "I just wanted you to know that, even after everything, I hope you find the peace you didn't find with me. That one day you'll forgive yourself. And that, if you look back, you'll see that, despite the end, there was someone who loved you beyond measure. And that, no one can take away from you." Laura paused the video. She couldn't watch it to the end. Her breath was short. Her hands were cold. She wasn't crying like before. Now it was something else. It was a kind of pain that isn't expressed with tears, but with the complete loss of breath. It was the realization that, even after all the destruction, he still saw her with kindness. And that was what hurt the most. In the weeks that followed, she tried to find ways to move on. She began writing again. Short texts she kept to herself. Memories transformed into words. Fragments of a time that would never return. She also began visiting the city's art gallery more often. She watched exhibitions in silence, feeling close to something that reminded her of him, without needing to talk about it with anyone. And it was on one of these visits that he met Clara again. The two passed each other in the side aisle of the new exhibition. Clara was holding a catalogue and, upon seeing her, smiled kindly. Laura responded with a wave, and to her surprise, Clara approached. This time, the conversation took place. The two sat on a bench, and Clara spoke bluntly about the love she had found with Daniel. She said he spoke of Laura with respect, that he never omitted anything, and that he carried with him the memory of the past without denying it, but without nourishing it. Laura listened in silence. And then, in a gesture she hadn't planned, she opened her purse and handed Clara the flash drive. "This is his. Maybe he forgot, or maybe, he didn't have the courage to show you. But you deserve to know everything." Clara took the object, surprised. He looked into Laura's eyes, searching for some hidden intention, but found only truth. They stood there for a few more minutes, in silence. When they said goodbye, there was no resentment. No rivalry. Just two women connected by the same man, in different times, by stories that, though painful, had inevitably intersected. Laura left the gallery that day feeling a little lighter. Not because she had been forgiven, not because the pain had subsided, but because, somehow, she had accepted that she couldn't change the past. But she could at least be honest about what remained. And that, at that point in her life, was something. Time would still bring other lessons. Other goodbyes. But now, she was prepared for whatever came. Because she had finally understood that love, when true, even if it doesn't last forever, leaves marks that educate. That shape. That transform. And no one could ever take that away from her. Time passed slowly, as if knowing that the damage from that story needed to mature within each person so that they could, one day, find some form of healing. The seasons changed, and with them, so did the colors of the streets, the sounds of the days, the places that once held painful memories and now slowly began to lose their emotional weight. Daniel continued his life with the same quiet lightness that had always accompanied him. He and Clara traveled, as they had planned, and returned different, not because they had experienced something new, but because, on that trip, they finally understood that they were ready to build something that didn't need to rise from the ashes of nothing. It was during this journey, between small towns and nights of long conversations, that Daniel became certain, there was love there. Not the suffocated love that demands constant proof, but the calm love that welcomes without holding back, that looks forward without carrying ghosts. Upon returning, he began preparing a new photography project, this time focused on rebirth. He no longer spoke of loss. Now, he spoke of new beginnings. And alongside Clara, Daniel didn't just start over, he allowed himself to be happy, without fear, without reservations, without a shadow of the past. Laura, on the other hand, traveled a longer and more solitary path. Not because she lacked opportunities for distraction or even new relationships, but because, for the first time in her life, she understood that she couldn't share space with anyone until she could look in the mirror without feeling ashamed. She spent some time in silence, introspective, rebuilding herself from the pieces that remained. She read a lot. She wrote even more. Her writing began to circulate in small online groups, texts about regret, about choices, about wounds that don't heal with time, but with the responsibility of those who caused them. She didn't victimize herself. She didn't reinvent herself as a wronged heroine. Quite the opposite. Her honesty was brutal. And perhaps it was this brutality that began to attract readers. People who saw in her someone who had the courage to admit irreversible mistakes. Soon, Laura received an invitation to turn her writing into a book. Initially, she resisted, fearing it would be unnecessary exposure. But later, she understood that perhaps the only way to honor the love she destroyed was to transform her pain into learning for others. The book was published with a straightforward title, What You Lose When You Stop Listening to the Ones Who Love You. And there, page by page, she left the most honest part of herself. Enrique, Daniel's brother, remained close to both of them, respecting the new forms their bonds had taken. Even though he had distanced himself from Laura after the breakup, he harbored no resentment. He was grateful that she had given Clara the flash drive. That gesture, for him, was one of the clearest proofs that Laura was no longer the same person she had been before. Not because regret purified her, but because the pain changed her. Henry also moved on, focused on his career and family responsibilities. Over time, he became one of the few silent points of connection between their past and present. He never tried to bring them back together. He understood that certain stories only make sense as memories. And he knew they both knew it. Clara, for her part, watched everything with a clear heart. Living alongside someone who was broken inside requires more than love, it requires maturity. She never demanded that Daniel erase his past, never asked for proof of the present. Her love didn't compete with what had been. And perhaps that's why she earned a permanent place in his heart. Seeing the video Daniel left on the flash drive, which he himself never had the courage to show her, Clara cried. Not out of insecurity, but out of empathy. She understood the depth of what he had experienced, the pain he had endured in silence, the generosity of someone who chose silence to protect their own dignity. She never brought up the subject. She simply hugged him, tighter, more whole. She knew that loving someone like that required not just presence, but acceptance. Years later, Laura and Daniel crossed paths again. It was by chance, at a literary event. She was there as a guest author for a discussion on forgiveness and rebuilding. He was there as a photographer invited to exhibit his new collection of portraits about second chances. When they saw each other, there was neither surprise nor discomfort. They greeted each other with a discreet smile, a restrained wave. Later, in a corner of the room, they talked for a few minutes. They didn't reopen wounds. They didn't revisit pain. Laura said she had read an interview with him about the new project and was moved by the way he spoke about starting over. Daniel replied that he had read part of her book and admired her courage in owning her story without embellishment. They both smiled, and there was a comfortable silence. The same kind of silence they once shared at home, before everything fell apart. But now, it wasn't the silence of someone who loves, it was the silence of someone who finally understands. As they said goodbye, Daniel wished she would keep writing. Laura wished he would keep loving as he always had, whole. And so they moved on. Without nostalgia. Without weight. Just with the lightness of knowing each one was exactly where they needed to be. And that's how it all ended. With real losses, with definitive consequences, but also with growth. Because life doesn't always deliver justice in the form of redemption. Sometimes it delivers in the form of understanding. And when that happens, all that's left is to move on with dignity. Daniel built a new chapter where love was peaceful. Laura learned that losing someone by choice is a kind of pain that teaches more than any external punishment. And Clara showed that true love doesn't require being first, it just needs to be right. Now that you've made it this far, tell us in the comments, what did you think of this story? Do you think Daniel should have truly forgiven? Or do you believe his choice was the most fair one possible? We want to hear your opinion, it's very important. And of course, if you enjoy stories that stir emotions, that provoke real reflections on life and relationships, subscribe to the channel now and activate the bell so you don't miss any new videos. This story teaches us that betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships, it destroys futures, families, connections, memories. It breaks something that, once broken, never returns. Love needs to be cared for, respected, and cultivated truthfully. A thoughtless choice, a sustained lie, can cost the most precious thing, trust. And finally, never forget, this channel does not support any type of betrayal here, we tell stories that show the real consequences of bad choices, not to judge, but to reflect. Until the next video. And remember, love is, above all, choosing not to hurt those we love.